This is from a network of European academics who are working together on related issues. And the theme is reorganization, not redistribution, which will seem a little cryptic to you. Let me start by explaining why redistribution won't work. Our society is partly constructed around the idea that we can make capitalism work better by giving people income to spend on the market. That was, I think, the idea which directly underpinned the whole Blairite strategy of wage top-ups. And indirectly, if you read dear old Piketty, the idea of raising income and wealth tax rates is deeply tied up with the idea, I think, that you take it from one set of people and give it to another, that you redistribute income. And what I want to argue is there's nothing wrong with this technology, but it's not going to work in the UK now, because with a deregulated labour market and 300,000 economic migrants a year coming in, you're undermining the position of everybody in the lower half of the income distribution. And the end result is that however many people of goodwill you gather round in this conference, the economic demand for subvention of low wages outruns the political willingness of the electorate to tax themselves to pay for it. And at this point, of course, you get people, the entrance not of New Labour, but of Osborne and welfare cuts. And there is, of course, a very large element of sheer nastiness about Osborne's welfare cuts. But apart from that, there's a basic realism about the unsustainability of the bill for wage subvention. Let's look at a basic calculation about the percentage of working households who are receiving more in benefits than in taxation, than they're paying as taxes. Working households, excluding those on social security, excluding pensioners. And what you'll see is, if you look at it, is that in the late 1970s, around 27% of non-retired households received more in benefits than they paid in taxes. These were basically low-paid households with loads of children. But by the time you reach the end of New Labour and Blair Brown's triumph, they've pushed it towards 40%. 40% of working households receiving more in benefits than they pay in taxes. It's clearly unsustainable. The technology of redistribution is at an end. That brings me to the second, more opaque strategy of reorganization. I'm going to argue for inclusive reorganization around foundational activities, and also argue that you need to involve big business absolutely centrally. If you think of the material security of the population, it depends on foundational goods and services: food, healthcare, education, housing, all the things that refugees want to go to Germany or the UK for. That's what really matters. And it's very interesting that if you say that what you should do is reorganize to ensure that these basic foundational goods are available for all the population, this takes you back to Richard Titmuss and the idea that they should be supplied without discrimination, to the idea that, for example, we should build large amounts of high-quality social housing, not no housing for the poor or second-rate housing for the poor, in a sense that we should recover the Simon vision of Wythenshawe as a kind of garden city for the working class, which, whatever's happened to it since, is an absolutely marvelous vision of what you do to a soot-stained brick terrace city and how you build an alternative. And here's the point at which I'm going to differ from Kless. Kless, I think, talks always, and talks well, about the role of anchor institutions, by which they mean the public sector. The police in Preston, the university, the local council. Well, the sad fact is that in the last 35 years, we've had privatization and outsourcing and business-friendly regulation. And they have all given the public sector a much diminished role and the private sector a leading role in society. And what we have done, in effect, is given business rights without any conditions about responsibilities whatsoever. Let me take the example of supermarkets, because there are loads of private sector firms who are tied by their branches and networks, just as surely as universities or police forces. Supermarkets can't go anywhere else because they need the branches to take the money. BT can't go anywhere else. It's tied by the network. It's a grounded firm. Now, if you look at that, what you then have is, on average in Manchester, if you look at the whole city, the households are spending £50 a week or more in supermarkets. They can't go away. What are we getting in return? Low wages, 0 hours. We've got the whole of the food processing sector pretty comprehensively fucked up in the UK, so nobody can run a public company in it. And we've got dairy farmers going out of business week in, week out. Oh yes, and at the checkout, they've got a load of sweetie things which are going to try and poison you and your children. Wake up. We're trying to encourage, the University College of Lancashire in Preston to be virtuous. It's time we asked big business about questions about social responsibility. And I could talk about how we might do this, because we've published on social licensing for grounded firms. But what I want to do now is say that what we have in Manchester and in many other places isn't social responsibility around inclusive reorganization. What we have is what I would describe quite coldly as public-private collusion in social exclusion. And I would ask you to think about Pomona. How many people here know the Pomona strip between Pomona and Cornbrook metro stations? A scrap of wasteland left over from the Salford Manchester Ship Canal Company, which Peel Holdings bought and now owns. Just about a month ago, the Greater Manchester Housing Fund, i.e. the local authorities, lent 17 million so that Fred Doan of Betfred could build 380 flats on that site. And at the same time, they lent 10 million to Rowlinson Developments, a Stockport-based firm, to build 164 flats on that site. There was no social housing envisaged in either of these schemes, though Salford alone has 14,000 people on its waiting list, because Salford is in fact the Manchester borough which has the lowest share of council housing in its list. The other thing that's absolutely tragic is, of course, that this is the last area of developable green space of urban park adjacent to the centre. And what will the bastards do? They'll put one block of cheap flats after another on it, so that it's all built over, and it has to be built over because nobody's going to question Peel Holdings. This is taking a little period of time, but I think you do need to be brought to a certain place where you realize that good intentions are not being realized in the world as it is. What to do next? Well, I think what you have to do is think much more radically than the previous speakers about unsettling power and knowledge. And I think specifically you've got to disrupt established political franchises and the professional political classes. Now, disruption is a very dangerous process, and I've spent much of my life resisting it politically. But I do rather cheer at this point when we are at the Corbyn moment. Nobody's mentioned Corbyn. Corbyn is the man who's kicked over the stall of the Parliamentary Labour Party, just as the Scott Nats kicked over the stall of those 51 Scots Labour MPs. And I think what's delightful is at this disruption moment, we always have a progressive next step of disruption. Like the number one thing that would be progressive in Manchester would be to field an independent mayoral candidate in the next election. Somebody who's sort of challenged. It doesn't have to be bloody well right. That's all he's got to do is actually highlight the way in which people like Corbyn does, that Burnham and Cooper and Kendall are just bloody androids caught up with the New Labour script. And everywhere you go in the UK, you can think of something that you would actually want to do. Like in Wales, get a Plaid minister into the coalition and in charge of the economic ministry. And, in Scotland, encourage, as the TUC is already, to actually ask the Scot Nats, why, if you are so different, are your policies all exactly the same? It's a marvelous prospect we have ahead of us. But, and this is another point, I think, we do need to change knowledge as well. And I think this is quite fundamental, the change of knowledge. I don't think we are at a point where we know enough to move to action. And I think one of the problems here is clearly we have a kind of hand-wringing specialist social science which enumerates the many ways, the many miseries of the world and the inequalities of the world, but it can't counter the trade narratives which conceal opportunity and create a world of false necessity. I spent a couple of years working on things like railways, etc. And the key thing is that the trade associations which represent big business put out a load of bullshit which no academic queries whatsoever. And essentially the problem is that the number of academics who are financially literate is virtually zero. And we live in a form of financialized capitalism where respectable knowledge is financially illiterate. This is not a good thing. And I will now give you another example of how this is not a good thing. Let's take the example of adult care, which is clearly, it's one of my obsessions. I think it's a test of our civilization, which we fail abjectly. And now, of course, it's a Manchester responsibility under devolution. And what we have in adult care is very interesting, because private equity moved into the sector. It created financialized chains which have essentially gone to the courts and obtained in the Sefton judgment the verdict that a 12% return on capital employed is included in the fair price that a local authority should pay. A 12% return on capital employed. This seemed to me a bit steep. So I actually asked some friends in private equity if I wanted to build a residential home, find me an American pension fund, and what would they, what would I have to pay? And they rang me back and they said 8%, Karel, and we can get CalPERS or somebody of that sort to build a residential home. So there are two private benchmarks. The one that's upheld by the courts, 12%, or 8% if I want to move into the residential care business myself. You have to pinch yourself and say local authorities can borrow for substantially less than 5% if they were to build. And the return on my university teacher's pension fund and on most local authority pension funds is about 5%. So you can actually, I'll spare you the management accounting, but this is to illustrate the point about financial literacy. At 12% return on capital employed, you're paying the present misery wages of £7 something an hour, according to the labour force survey. If you were to reduce the return on capital employed to 8%, you could, and I were to get into the business myself, I could offer people 22% higher wages. If you were to reduce the roast to 5%, you could actually offer people nearly 40% higher wages. The burden of financial illiteracy is total in our society when it comes to criticism. And I remain, however, exceedingly optimistic, because I think if you consider how we are at a moment of disruption and how relatively easy it is to add a measure of financial literacy to the argument, then I remain optimistic that the situation is delightfully uncontrollable from the point of the established powers. Thank you very much.